Skyrocketing inflation, a shortage of essential items for daily living, political unrest, and an economy at the brink of total meltdown. Sri Lanka's list of problems is unending. The island nation of 22 million people is going through what can be termed its worst economic crisis in decades. The political fallout which has contributed to this crisis is already being felt across borders. As it stands, Sri Lanka is currently in the midst of its worst economic crisis in over 70 years. In this video, we'll look into the series of events that have led to Sri Lanka's economic collapse and also the consequences it has brought to the country. In 2022, for the first time in history, Sri Lanka failed to make an interest payment on its foreign debt. This is the worst state the economy has faced. Accelerating fuel prices have led to queues lasting for days at fuel stations. Public service is also in shambles, with food shortages leaving thousands of Sri Lankans hungry. Government debt, on the other hand, is now over 100% as a percentage of GDP, and this is projected to get worse in the coming years if nothing is done about the situation. As you would have guessed, this pathetic situation is not without a cause. Recent global happenings have been linked to Sri Lanka's failing economy. These include the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis in Ukraine. Since the pandemic and war are global phenomena, rises in food, fuel, and commodity prices have triggered intense shocks, particularly in countries with low levels of societal resilience like Sri Lanka. Globally, food insecurity is on the rise and is projected to increase by 43% by 2050, hence propelling threats and fears of further doom to the current economy of Sri Lanka. However, while the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have both wreaked havoc on the global economy, the problems facing Sri Lanka cannot be solely blamed on these factors. The situation has been worsened by a number of unique domestic factors, which must be identified if we're truly to understand how Sri Lanka arrived at this position. The factors that have wreaked havoc on Sri Lanka didn't start recently, but it really did hit rock bottom in 2022. As 2022 began, the situation in Sri Lanka appeared blurry, with inflation rates soaring and commodity prices rising to unexpected heights. Then, the World Bank estimated that over 500,000 people in Sri Lanka had fallen below the poverty line. The country was experiencing food, fuel, and even medicine shortages as well as daily blackouts. The economy basically began to crumble beyond previous speculations. In response to the deteriorating situation, the then-president Gotabaya Rajapaksa declared an economic emergency, authorizing the military to regulate the prices of basic commodities. These actions did little to ease the crisis, to say the least, leading to nationwide anti-government protests that caused a lot of deaths and injuries. The protesters accused the government of gross economic mismanagement, which contributed to the crisis. This brings us to the very root of the domestic causes of Sri Lanka's doom: foreign debt. Rajapaksa's government dominated Sri Lankan politics for 2 decades. Those years were characterized by widespread accusations of financial mismanagement, corruption, nepotism, and authoritarianism. In 2009, after the brutal 30-year civil war in Sri Lanka, there was hope for development in the country. In order to rebuild the country following the conflict, Sri Lanka relied on foreign loans as a solution. Currently, the country owes foreign lenders over $51 billion, with China being the highest lender, owning 10% of the debt among others. This would not have been so serious an issue, except that there are no viable means on ground to pay these debts. Due to the failure of the government to pay these debts, a major port within Sri Lanka was given to China on a 99-year lease. Following the civil war, there was also a cessation in foreign trade. The Sri Lankan government instead focused on providing goods to its domestic market, importing $3 billion more than the country exports each year. This reliance on imports against rising commodity prices has been a catastrophe for the Sri Lankan economy. Considering that fuel imports made up 20% of inbound shipments in 2022 and literally jumping by 88% from the previous year. Besides these debts, mismanagement of public funds has been an infamous issue with Sri Lanka. Through the past decade, the government has also been accused of undertaking massive vain infrastructure projects, such as the Matala Rajapaksa International Airport or the Mahinda Rajapaksa International Cricket Stadium, both of which see very little operational usage and generate no revenue for the country despite costing billions of dollars. What's most disheartening is that these big projects were often financed by unsustainable loans from China and occurred at the same time as the Rajapaksa governments carried out massive tax cuts and agricultural policies that further cut revenue. Looking back at the decisions made by President Rajapaksa, it's almost impossible to say Sri Lanka's downfall was not the call. In 2021, he announced an immediate ban on fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. These actions destroyed crops and contributed to the already growing food shortage. After some time, the ban was later reversed, but the deed had been done. Food shortage was already in abundance and the farmers had suffered terrible losses, further discouraging them. It will not be a surprise if some of them left the practice after such a devastating incident. The aftermath of the disturbing policy, as you already guessed, was a wild hike in the cost of agricultural produce within Sri Lanka, forcing the already indebted government to rely on increased imports of grain from neighboring countries. So make no mistake, it's not the pandemic nor the Russian-Ukrainian war, but the intersection of these unsustainable and ineffective economic policies that has left the Sri Lankan economy in an extremely vulnerable state to shocks to this day. Another domestic cause of Sri Lanka's economic crisis is the collapse of the country's tourism industry. There is no clearer example of economic vulnerability within Sri Lanka than the collapse of the tourism industry. Years before, Sri Lanka's economy had profited greatly from tourism. In fact, the economy had been highly dependent on tourism, a sector that accounted for over 12% of the country's GDP. However, this was severely affected by the Civil War. Following the conclusion of the Civil War, plans for recovery of the tourism sector were put in place. There was a massive investment in the sector aided by international loans with hopes of improving the country's economy. However, the deadly terrorist attacks that made headlines during the Civil War posed a threat, even after the war had ended. One notable one is an incident that happened in 2019 on Easter Sunday. That particular attack left over 250 people dead and 500 injured, directly impacting the number of travelers. In 2016, Sri Lanka was ranked 104 out of 161 in the Global Terrorism Index. However, terrorism only grew worse in the region, making the country rise to as high as 18 in rank following the 2019 attacks. To date, Sri Lanka remains high on the Global Terrorism Index and is currently the 27th most impacted country by terrorism. Little wonder that tourism has become a struggle for the country. Before the famous 2019 attacks, tourism was worth $5.61 billion to the Sri Lankan economy. However, in 2020, this fell to $1.08 billion. And if that wasn't enough, the COVID-19 pandemic almost entirely shut down Sri Lanka's tourism industry before it had a chance to recover. Again, as the industry began its post-COVID recovery, something else brought it down. The Russian invasion of Ukraine began, further incapacitating the sector. The Sri Lankan economy has typically been dwarfed. Even though the journey to recovery is possible, it will be a long, lonely path. The country currently needs billions of dollars monthly to import food and fuel, despite being bankrupt and having almost no foreign currency reserves. It's hoped that the IMF will go to the rescue. However, this might not happen until Sri Lanka has a functioning government that can develop an economic recovery plan and prove that its debts can become sustainable. Although the economic situation in Sri Lanka is bleak, it's not the only country facing economic obstacles at the moment. Rocketing in interest rates, inflation, and devaluing currencies are also major problems for other countries in the region. The difference between those coping countries and sinking Sri Lanka is the island nation's extremely low resilience to economic shock. Therefore, it's important for countries with a high level of debt that are facing similar economic crises to take a cue from Sri Lanka's downturn and evaluate their responses to economic issues. As new policies and strategies to revive the economy are being implemented, subscribe to this channel to get all the recent information as they come. Do give us a thumbs up if you like this video, and yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Until next time.